All right, so welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to meet you. And it looks like we have closed captioning appearing, which is fantastic. And again, if at any point you have any questions, so my name is Megan Padden. Most of my students just know me as Miss Megan or simply Megan. Um, so I don't know, Claire, do you want to talk a little bit more about Bolo School?
Yes. Hi, I'm Claire Lu, and I'm the founder and the CEO of Boluo School. So Boluo School is a premier online tutoring company, and we have tutoring in subjects such as English, math, and social studies, Spanish speech and debate, and test prep. And so what set us apart from other tutoring companies are all our teachers, they are well qualified, and we do a screen and we vet our tutors. And yeah, if we have good tutors like Megan, for example, we just you know keep her. So Megan, how long have you been working with us? 4 or 5 years?
Um, yeah, it just hit 5 years, I think either last month or this month. It's gone by really fast.
Yeah. So we have very good relationship with our highly qualified tutors, and we believe the long-term relationship is a key for the success of our students. So with that, I want to present our speaker today, Miss Megan. And she, as she said, she has been with us for 5 years, and she has been awesome with our students. She is very experienced in English reading and writing, and her specialty is also includes a test prep, including SAT, ACT, and private school exams such as ISEE, SSAT. So with that, I will have Megan talk about the new SAT, what's about, and how we can prepare.
Right. Thanks, Claire. So again, I'm Megan or Miss Megan, whichever you prefer. And like Claire says, I've been with Boluo School for 5 years. I have been in the field of education for almost 20 years, and I have done test prep for, gosh, probably over 15 years of that. So I've done SAT, ACT, TOEFL, ISEE, SSAT. If it's a test with an acronym, I have probably done some sort of prep work with it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about the SAT, which has gone through some major changes. And this one is actually a really beneficial change for students. So one of the top questions that we receive is, what exactly is the SAT? It's one of two main college admissions tests, the other one being the ACT, and I will talk briefly about the ACT. So for the SAT, the scores range from 400 to 1600. And how the scores are broken down, you have raw scores, which I'll show you what that looks like here momentarily. It's 1 point for each correct answer. There are no penalties for incorrect answers. But again, it's it's one of those things where it is best to take your best guess for a number of these questions. So as far as how this test is broken down, so there are four scored sections. You have two reading and writing sections, and we're going to talk about that momentarily, two math sections, and there are experimental sections that do occasionally appear at the very end. The good news is they are not counted toward your SAT score. So let's say that there is an experimental math section and you're taking it and saying, "Oh my goodness, this is really, really hard," or "I'm not sure how to answer these." Um, those particular questions are not going to count against you, and they may or may not appear. I have been seeing them appear more often than not. So I'm curious, have any of you taken the SAT before, either last year or any of you scheduled to take it this year? Okay, we're a little shy today. That's okay. Um, so with the SAT, as far as the breakdown, this is what I'm talking about with the raw score and the actual score. So the question breakdown, this is actually more based on the older format of how the test is broken down. So, for example, if I look at the writing and language score, which again, this is based on the old format, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. Let's say that you had all 44 questions correct. You're going to notice your raw score looks like a 40, but it's actually going to be a 400. That's the highest score that you can potentially get because again, your reading and writing total up to 800, your two math sections total up to 800, which breaks down into that 1600 score. And you'll notice for a few of these, if you do miss a question, like for example, for this old reading test, if you missed one question, you can still get a 1600. Assuming, of course, you had perfect scores on the other sections. So, again, this is just a general breakdown. And again, if at any point you have questions or if I'm going too fast, please let me know. So let's talk about the overall changes to the SAT. So I have been working with the SAT for a long time. Personally, I took the SAT for the first time in the early 2000s. It's gone through about 4 or 5 different changes since then. So starting next month, it's going to be a fully digital test. This is really significant because up until last year, the middle of last year, they only had paper copies of the SAT test. And of course, because of everything with COVID, the testing they found would be better digital because it offers more opportunities for students. So, those of you that may have taken the PSAT this past fall, um, that particular test is already digital or was already digital. And we're going to talk about how that works here momentarily. There was a pilot program that started in the fall of 2023. I did have a student who was enrolled in the program. She took the old test in paper, she took the new version digitally, and she did notice some major changes. And for her, the difficulty she said was about the same, and she scored pretty similarly between the two tests. This other part that I have here, adaptive learning, what exactly that means is let's say that you're doing a series of questions and you start to notice that the questions become increasingly more challenging. That means that there is a high likelihood that you had the question correct. And so, because it's digital, now the questions can actually adapt. So, if they feel like they're becoming more challenging, that most likely means that you're getting the questions correct. If they become easier, that might mean maybe you're missing a few questions as you go. Now, can you go back and let's say mark a question for review? Absolutely. And that's something I tell my students all the time. If you're going through a section, you're looking at a question, don't spend too much time on that one question. Make a little mark on it, and there's a button that you can click that does that. That says return later or flag for review. Um, Again, I highly encourage students to use that capability just because I know tests can be really intimidating. And it's better not to spend too much time on one question. So here's one of the other benefits as far as the change. So it's digital. It has adaptive learning. Instead of it being 3 hours long, it is now 2 hours. When I've told students that, they get really excited. They're like, "Wait, it's not 3 hours." No, it's just 2. The other bonus to this is reading passages have also become way shorter. And when I say way shorter, they are probably about half the length of what they were. And a little bit later, I'll show you a comparison of the 2023 and earlier version to the 2024 going forward version. Um, One of the top questions that I hear from students and families, does the SAT have an essay? So in 2016, they had an essay. In 2020, they made it optional. And in 2021, they said, you know what? Only about 4 schools in the entire United States wanted this. We're just going to completely discontinue it because it wasn't beneficial. Um, so there is no optional test. The last one for this that's a major change, calculators are permitted for all math sections. This is huge because the older tests, you had 2 math sections. Now, you still have that now. The difference is now you can use a calculator for all parts. So in the digital version, which I'll show you here momentarily, they built in what's called a Desmos calculator. Now, for parents who are in the meeting, if you're not sure what this is, that's okay. Usually when I say Desmos, 9 out of 10 students will say, "Oh my goodness, I know what that is. We use it in school all the time." Um, it is something that is a huge benefit, especially if you kind of find that you're getting a little bit stuck with math problems. A student I was working with earlier, for example, she's in calculus this year. She's struggling with some of the earlier materials, which is really common for my upper level math students because it's something they haven't worked with in 4 or 5 years. I've told her, use that calculator. There is nothing wrong with using it as a tool to double check your answers. Um, the other question I get, can my student bring an approved calculator into the testing center? Yes. They are still allowing that. And again, there is a list on the College Board website that will kind of say which ones are allowed, which ones aren't allowed. Okay. Any questions so far from anyone? And again, feel free to send any questions through the chat that you might have. Okay. All right. So again, this is just a further breakdown to give you an idea of how different it looks. And again, I'll pull up a practice one here momentarily just to show you the difference. So the old format, you can see you have a way longer reading section. Um, and the writing language section is pretty similar to what you would see for section 2 as far as duration. But again, the time has been cut down. The same with the number of questions. Originally, you're reading 52 questions. Now you have 2 sets of 27. The other thing to keep in mind when you're going through those, it used to be reading was very separate, writing and language was very separate. They are mixed together. The first part is a little bit more reading focused. The second part is a little bit more grammar language focused. For the math components, again, the main difference would be less questions overall and the use of a calculator for both math sections, which again is new for students to be able to do. Okay. This is also, again, a little bit more detail about the reading and language section because, again, I've had a lot of questions about this. We just talked about that first part. Reading and language are blended throughout the first 2 sections. This is where it gets interesting because in older versions of the practice test, you would see no change as an option for a number of questions. This is no longer an answer choice. What they might do is they might put the original question, like the original example, whether it's a sentence, whether it's a word, or whether it's, an edit that needs to be made. The word no change is no longer an option. Passage lengths, again, significantly shorter. So for the most part, they are 300 words or less versus 500 to 750 words per passage. This is actually significantly beneficial if you're someone who is not a fast reader or maybe struggles with speed reading. This does make these passages a little bit less daunting and a little bit less intimidating. However, you're still going to see history-based passages. You're still going to see passages from 1920 and before, science passages, etc. One of the biggest changes this has scared a number of my high school students is poetry is now included. And when I say poetry is now included, I have seen Shakespeare showing up on here. I have seen some Robert Frost showing up on here, some Emily Dickinson. This is actually the first time that poetry has appeared on the regular SAT. And I have looked at SATs from as far back as 2000, and there has never been poetry within the last 24 years. So it is something that is new. um, it did appear on what was called the subject-based SAT tests, but those particular SAT tests were discontinued in 2021. So one of the questions that I've been getting from families is, "Oh my goodness, this is such a new concept. Where can I find review materials?" Um, so some of those old subject-based SAT tests, specifically the English ones, you will have access to poetry through those. They can be a little tricky to find. Um, and again, it is something that is really good practice. Now, are students going to have to label rhyme scheme or anything like that? No. Specifically, the poetry is related to comprehension. There may be some questions related to figurative language, but for the most part, it's related to comprehension theme, similar concepts that you would see throughout your typical reading passages. Okay, so we're going to talk about Blue Book. And again, if you've already taken the PSAT, or if you've played around with the College Board website at all, Blue Book is one of those programs that is really helpful. There are a few things just to bear in mind with it that tend to kind of be a little daunting, but we'll talk about this momentarily. So, Blue Book is the app that College Board wants you to download. It's where students register to take their SAT and PSAT alongside College Board. They do have 4 free digital practice tests with a breakdown of all the question types. So, anytime I start working with my students, since this test has been released, I encourage them to go on the site, take a practice test in its entirety, and to share your scores with me because unlike the previous tests, which are paper, which require a little bit more combing through the data, this actually streamlines the data, which makes it significantly easier to see which areas to target. So, for example, if I have a student take this and I'm seeing a pattern with modifier usage, I can say, okay, we're going to target misplaced modifiers, dangling modifiers, or let's say it's a math concept like the heart of algebra, which is a common math theme. I can go in and say, okay, heart of algebra was a challenge. And I can align that with a number of SAT resources that I have, both in electronic format and in paper book format. And again, I have some resources I can kind of explain to you all that I recommend for any of the students that I work with. So let's talk about this. So, first of all, if you have not already signed up for College Board. I highly recommend it. Um, so there's 2 things to keep in mind when you do this. So I'm gonna stop share for just a moment. Once you download Blue Book, you'll get this handy dandy fun little app that shows up. And so it appears, hopefully, there it goes. It appears looking like this. So there's 2 ways that you can sign in. The first one is if you've already registered with your school. So let's say that you signed up for the PSAT in the fall and you have a sign in ticket. This is most likely for when you're signing in to take your test. If you've already taken it, you do want to check to see if your scores are in. I have had some students who did not see their PSAT scores. If at any point you're not able to see those scores, you definitely want to communicate with College Board because they are still working on a few technological things. So, logging into this, you just want to sign in with your College Board email account. For me, it's just my regular email, if I can type it. Um, if I can get the right password. Oh, let me try that again. We're going to try that one more time, and hopefully, I'll put the right password in this time. The other thing I'll tell you when I'm going in and logging in, if you leave the dashboard idle for too long, it can log you out on the platform. So when you log in, this is the page that you'll see. You'll see test preview and you'll see full length practice. So what you can do is you can go into any one of the 4 practice tests that are there and let's say that you're like, you know what? I don't want to take an SAT test yet. I want to do a PSAT related assessment. I'm still in middle school. So I want to kind of, enter into this a little slowly. You can certainly do that. I recommend hitting the ground running. And what you can do from here is you can pick any one of the 4 tests. Now, the practice essays, again, we've talked about this already. These are not a requirement for colleges at this point. Again, because when students start to apply for college, they work on different types of essays and those vary widely, but that's a whole other lecture that, can happen another time. So, I'm just going to pick one of these tests at random. So, this says it's in progress. I'm just going to hit start over. So, a couple of things to keep in mind when you're working with this. If you or your student, um, because I'm not sure if this is just students or parents or both, if you happen to have accommodations, this does give you that capability. And I've had people go, wait a second, how can I get accommodations? Um, these are specifically reserved for students who may have here in the US something called an IEP plan, individualized education plan, or 504 plan. Um, so let's say, for example, that a student has maybe some sort of accommodations such as extended testing time. That can be put on there. And I just had a great question. Can parents register on Blue Book? Absolutely. Parents can register on Blue Book. I used my personal email for this one. Parents definitely can register on there as well. Um, and I think it can be on the same account if I remember correctly, but great question. So yeah, so getting back into this. So again, extended time, but that's again a case by case basis. When you're working on these practice tests, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go, you do have the ability to pause them for the simulation tests. However, when you actually take your SAT, you won't have that flexibility. Um, it'll just be whenever there's that scheduled break that's going on. Um, but I always recommend with students, I know a lot of my high school students are juggling a ton of AP classes. So I always say, you know what? If you can do it in a regular sitting, simulating, a test setting, go for it. If for whatever reason you're not able to, that is okay. Because for our purposes in sessions, again, we like to kind of see where students are and how we can elevate them further as learners. So, again, this is a practice test. And again, you'll get this pop up, and I'll talk a little bit just about how this works. You do have an annotation tool, it just lets you highlight. I tell students this is something that's really helpful, especially when you're trying to find keywords, key phrases, and things like that. Um, there's also shortcuts as well. There's a line reader. So let's say that, you're going in to take your SAT, maybe you didn't sleep as well as you wanted. This can definitely help as far as kind of narrowing things down. Um, whether you need to look at one line, one word, one phrase. Um, and again, you can also save and exit. So let's say, for example, you're working on a practice test, and then you're like, "Ooh, I have to study for that math test I have tomorrow." You can save and exit. So the next thing I can do is again, I can mark for review, which is this wonderful button up here. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. You don't want to spend too much time on one question. If you're looking at a question and you feel like your head is spinning, mark it for review, come back to it after, pace yourself with it. The other thing, again, crossing out those wrong answers, those are always super helpful to do. Okay. So I can go back to the review page and you can see I marked question 1 for review. So I can go back to any of these questions in this section. What you have to keep in mind is once you get through a session, you're not able to go back. So when we finish module 1, we can't go back to module 1 once we're in module 2. So that is something to bear in mind. The other thing that you'll notice, there is the time at the top. I can hide that if the time makes me incredibly nervous. And I do have some students that say, I can't deal with the timer. It makes me nervous. It makes me scared. I want to hide it. You have that flexibility, which is great. Okay. So we're going to go to the end of this just because I want to show you what the math section looks like. So it's going to save your work. And again, it's going to do the same thing. And again, with these questions, these are vocab based ones, but they're not all vocabulary based ones. And part of why I'm speeding through this is I'll show you a better breakdown of the questions in a little while. This is more just to get you a little bit familiar with the platform itself. So if you're like, wait, I don't see what the other questions look like, I promise you we're going to get back to those in a little bit. Okay. So let me show you just what the math section looks like on this platform. Okay. So we've gone through those 2 reading sections. And again, if you had extra time, like for extended time or whatever, you'll see the break time maybe being a little bit longer. So this says again, don't disturb, other students, keep your screen up, et cetera, et cetera. When you're doing this at home, you can hit resume testing. So say for example, you're like, I don't need 10 minutes. You don't have to wait those 10 minutes if you don't want to. Okay. So here is the math section. And again, like we mentioned before, our handy calculator. I absolutely love this. I was so excited when I saw that this was built in because it does do a lot of the work for you, especially if you get a little bit nervous. It's a great tool to have. And of course, if you're not a fan of Desmos, you're welcome to bring your own approved calculator. This other one is really helpful. It is a reference sheet of just some common formulas. and common math, terms and things like that. And then again, of course, we have a line reader if we need it. Shortcuts again to help us zoom in if we need it to annotate, things like that. Okay. And then I can go to my review page and I'm going to go to the end of it and show you how to find your scores at the end. Now, obviously, I'm going through this particular practice test very fast. I'm not going to pass it. But I do have one where I did pass it that I can show you all here momentarily, just to give you a breakdown. Okay, what it's going to do is it's going to show view your score. So this says go to mypractice.cb.org. Um, 9 out of my 10 students will forget it. So what I tell students is to go to that link I showed you in the PowerPoint. So I'm going to hit view your score. And so I have to do a new share. And I guarantee you I'm going to have to log in again. So let me actually stop share momentarily. And I am going to have to log in again. So that's where, again, it gets a little tricky. I'm going to log back in and then I'm going to reshare my screen. And I'm going to get an error message. Let's see. Let me share a screen. Okay. So you saw me skip those. So my minimum score here is a 400, and that's for me not clicking anything. Obviously, we want to make sure we don't get a 400. We want to aim for that nice friendly 1600. So a few things I can do, I can go to score detail. And so for fun on one of these, I clicked the wrong answer just because I wanted to see how it showed up. And I believe, where is it? There it is. So for this one, I can actually go back to the question, and this is a pretty friendly question. And what's nice about it is not only does it tell me what I chose, it tells me what the correct answer is. And I have a nice explanation at the bottom. So let's say that I really want to challenge myself because I know I missed this question. I can hit hide correct answer and explanation. And so sometimes I'll do that for my students. I'll say, all right, let's go to the question that we missed. Let's hide the correct answer and explanation. Let's see where we could have gone wrong with this particular problem. And again, this can be the same with reading, this can be the same with writing, etc. So here's the other really cool thing. If I go back, I can click on explore every question on Khan Academy. So the other thing I can even do, practice specific questions, which we just talked about. So this is a great tool to use in conjunction with your Bolo tutor as far as kind of going through things. And I say that because I've had students who some of them love Khan Academy and some of them say, okay, this is a video, it's too long. Can you please explain it in a way that, speaks to me that I can understand? So these questions match with the ones that you see in Blue Book. And again, I can go back to the words in context and I can say, okay, words and context questions, I need to practice those a little bit more. Or I can go to, let's see if I can find a different one here. Textual evidence. So the same thing, I can use this quote and say, okay, maybe I need to work with command of textual evidence. And again, these are also great resources to kind of help you beyond just the SAT. So a lot of what the SAT can tell you with, for example, vocabulary, textual evidence, etc., it can overlap into your English classes as well, and it can be used in conjunction with those English classes. So um, it's just great to have that particular knowledge. So, any questions so far before I pull up kind of the breakdown in a little bit more detail for specifically the reading and writing sections? No? Okay. So I'm going to show you just very quickly because I want to make sure I cover everything and leave some time for questions afterwards. Okay. So this is the old format of the test. And like I said before, you had the reading, the writing, and the two math. So as you can see right here, this is from a 1907 excerpt. I'm not going to read through this whole thing right now, but you can see it is significantly longer than a lot of the other questions. I mean, we're looking at close to 90 lines, and students would have to go back into the passage to find where these line numbers are. And it was a very tedious task. The other thing, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Where is it? There are dual passage questions, and Those are typically the more challenging questions. So you would have two passages about a related subject. Sometimes they talk about completely different perspectives. Sometimes the perspectives are very similar, but there's one thing that's different about it. And again, these were pretty long passages in the older versions. The newer version is very different. So this is the first section of the newer version. And again, this is different from the digital one that we already saw earlier. You're already seeing that these are a little bit more friendly. So vocabulary is isolated out for paragraphs instead of embedded into this long passage. So you also have excerpts as well that could talk about what is the main purpose. Here's our one that talks about poetry. So it says it's from a 1923 poem. And then it says which describes the overall structure of the text. So again, we're not looking at rhyme scheme. We're looking at just general comprehension based questions. Um, Again, we have another one, Walt Whitman's 1860 poem, Calamus 24. So what I recommend if you're like, what kind of poetry should I look at? I would say look at any poetry from maybe 1700 through about 1950. And the reason I say that is those tend to be much more complex as far as vocabulary. Now, can you look through William Shakespeare? Absolutely. He does show up in some of these practice tests. Just as a heads up. Okay, dual passage. So remember, we saw on this test over here how long these were. Look how short they are here, and you have one question instead of, about 11 questions for these two passages. So these are pretty friendly. And again, you can highlight and make annotations as you go. So the first section, like I said, here's another poem. The first section is more reading based. You do sometimes have some grammar based types of questions. You do still have charts that show up as well. Um, and again, you do have some grammar like number 20. You have to figure out, okay, is it had survived, survived, would survive, survives. And again, some punctuation questions as well. Part two, I'm just going to scroll really quickly over. Well, I'll scroll to that momentarily. Before we get to part two, this is also something that's relatively new for this particular version of the SAT. You'll have a question that says, while researching a topic, a student has taken the following notes. These notes can range on history topics, political topics, science topics, and a lot of times they're asking you questions like the student wants to do this with the information. What's the best way that the student can, make use of the information? So you do get a few of those questions typically near the very, very, very end of the reading and writing sections. And again, jumping into this is the second section. You're going to notice again vocabulary based short passages at the very beginning, word choice based questions. Now you're going to start seeing a little bit more grammar from this one, but you will still have reading comprehension questions. So it is switching between the two. They're not mutually exclusive like they were before. Here's another interesting change. So in the previous versions of the test, if you were looking for a quote to support a point, you had to go back to the passage. The SAT said, no, we're going to make these shorter. And instead of making you search for them, we're just going to embed the evidence right here for us to work with. And that's completely and totally, totally okay. So again, these first two formats, they remain pretty much the same. And again, they don't go terribly long. But again, for this one, you will see more grammar for that second part, but you also will still see some reading comprehension, just in general. And then again, at the very end, a student is researching a topic and writing some notes, and you have to answer a question about it. So, any questions on the reading and writing sections of this SAT? No? Okay. So, again, with the maths, oh, go ahead. I thought I heard a question. Go ahead. No? So for the math section, you'll notice I'm not hovering around that section as much. And again, the questions themselves for the math really have not changed all that much as far as the material. I've had students say, well, wait a second, when it comes to the SAT, what kind of math am I looking at? So I would recommend looking at Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry concepts. It's usually within those ranges as far as the math concepts go. Are there some that go a little bit beyond that? A little bit, but again, usually students who have just taken geometry, Algebra 1, Algebra 2 typically tend to be okay with the math if they're relatively strong math students. So there are, of course, multiple choice questions. A few of them you do have to type in numbers and things like that. But again, this has not changed from previous versions. So let's jump back into our PowerPoint for a moment here. So let me do this. So we talked about the practice questions already. We talked about access to Blue Book and what Blue Book does, how we find our scores in Blue Book, and why it's something that can be especially crucial. Okay. One of the next questions I get is, what do you recommend for test books? So these are ones that I use and that I highly recommend. Are there others? Absolutely. Princeton Review is one of my top choices just because they have been doing test prep across the board for decades. And their materials are very comprehensive, very detailed. Barron's test prep, I do like theirs as well. Theirs is pretty thorough and it has a great breakdown. Um, and of course, the official SAT study guide as well, because it's again from the people who put out the SAT. And again, I recommend that, especially with, working with your Bolo tutor, or if you're in one of our full class programs, working with your Bolo instructor. Okay, so the big question I get, the SAT versus the ACT, how does it work? So this is a breakdown of, again, how we see our test questions for the ACT. So English, it's a little bit longer, but look at that time frame, 45 minutes for 75 questions. Your math with a calculator, so the math is consistently with a calculator, 60 questions in 60 minutes. Reading is separate, and then science, and I'll show you what that science looks like here momentarily. Ooh, great question. The difference between the SAT and the PSAT. So the PSAT is scored a little bit differently than the SAT. It doesn't go up to 1600, and colleges do not see your PSAT scores. However, if you take your PSAT your junior year and you score within the top percentile, you can qualify for something called the National Merit Scholarship. And there's a lot of hoops to jump through for that, but there is a cash scholarship for the PSAT if you score within that range and if you go through to the finals. But that's really the only main difference. It's scored a little differently, but the questions are pretty much identical to the SAT. And again, your PSAT scores are not sent off to colleges. It's more so for your knowledge or if you want to get the National Merit Scholarship. So great question on that one. Okay. Um, so getting back to the ACT, there is a science section. Before you worry about that, you're not doing any sort of balancing equations. You're not trying to recall anything from um, biology class or anything like that. It's basically just another reading comprehension section. And I'll show you what that looks like here momentarily. The last part is an optional essay, and I wanted to emphasize the optional because when I looked for colleges that actually wanted this, it's less than 10. And it's it's very rare that colleges are looking for this again because pretty much every college that you'll apply to, you have to do an admissions essay, which is again an entire lecture in and of itself. So, how is it scored a little differently? You have 1 point for every correct answer. There is no penalty for wrong answers. And to get what's called your composite score, you would add up your English, math, reading, and science scores, take that total and divide it by 4. So it's not out of 1600. It's a little bit lower than that. So this is one of the top questions that I get all the time. Which one is best for me to take? It honestly depends. So a lot of students that are in the western part of the US tend to take the ACT a little more. The eastern part, it tends to be SAT. Can I take both? Absolutely. I've had students that love taking tests, which cool. Um, if you want to take both, you are certainly welcome to. What I recommend is start looking at colleges and start making a list for yourself of potential colleges that you want to apply to. dream schools, reach schools, safe schools, target schools, things like that. See what they require. Most schools, they accept both. There's not really a huge difference. Some schools are very flexible. They'll say that ACT or SAT is optional. And I always tell students, if you're a really strong test taker, it does not hurt to have that extra boost built into your application. So I always say, look at both types of tests. I've had students that were saying, man, I really want to take the ACT. I think the ACT is going to be my test. And they take the ACT and the SAT practices, and they say, well, gee, I feel like the SAT is more comfortable for me. And I've had the opposite true too. And sometimes the scores really differ. So, whatever's in your comfort level, go for it. And again, make sure you check colleges because, again, some might say, hey, we want the SAT, but not the ACT, and vice versa. There's no limit to how many times you take each test. I've known some students who they've taken it 7, 8 times because they really want that 1600. Um, Again, your call on that one, but there's no limit to how many times you take each. You are welcome to take both. So let's say you took the SAT and you want to take the ACT, you can do that. The good news is it does not matter which one you take because prepping for the SAT can help you prepare for the ACT, and the same is also true. So, a lot of that prep work is very similar. Before we get into questions, I'm going to show you really quickly here um, what the ACT looks like in comparison to the SAT. So this is an official released ACT test. And as you can see, just starting out, this is your English section, which again, 45 minutes, 75 questions. So this is how the SAT grammar section used to look. You would have a passage and you would be able to make corrections. Um, so great question. If a student takes at the SAT multiple times, will all the scores be sent to colleges? Can students choose what colleges or what to be sent to colleges? So great question. Um, there is an option when you take the test whether or not you want to send it to colleges, and you can choose which colleges to send it to. The other thing you can do is something called a super score. So let's say, for example, you take the SAT once and you get a perfect score on that reading and writing section going into it, but maybe math was an off day, you didn't do as well as you wanted. Can you retake it and super score it? Yes. So let's say you go in and you're like, well, my reading writing wasn't so great going into it, but my math score just totally made up for it. You can definitely do that. And colleges do kind of look at that and they do take that into account. The other thing I'll mention is that colleges do want to see that well-rounded um, person that you are. So the SAT is a part of that, but of course, extracurriculars and grades are also a significant part. But yeah, you can choose which colleges you send it to. So let's say you go in and initially when you fill out the bubbles, you're like, hey, I want to send this to all of my colleges. And then you're like, you know what? I don't think I did as well as I thought. I don't want to send this out. There is a way to kind of change your mind on that too. So that is something just to kind of keep in mind. So great question on that. Okay. So ACT, just going through this really quickly. I'm trying to keep an eye on time just in case there's other questions, but you guys are throwing some great ones out there today. So again, this is the English section. And as you can see, it's just sentence corrections. The writer wants to add something. Should the writer make this addition? Your second part coming up here is your math. And again, the mathematical concepts pretty much identical to the SAT as far as, the materials that you should be reviewing before taking it. And again, with this one, it's completely 100% multiple choice. That's the other significant math difference. Part 3 is reading. So you're going to notice now compared to the SAT, the ACT reading is significantly longer. The other thing is the ACT, as far as I know, is still paper. So that is the other thing to keep in mind. They have not gone digital as of yet. And again, you can see in the reading, you have a passage and then you have a series of questions that follow. So if you're like, ooh, I like the longer reading passages, ACT may be up your alley. And again, the themes are very similar. You have scientific passages, informational passages, history passages, fiction, etc. Okay. And then this one is that part that I told you about that the SAT does not have, and it's the science section. So as you can see with this, it's a lot like the dual passages of the SAT. You have scientist one, scientist two, and you're reading through and you're trying to kind of find, how does this person see this? How does this person see this? So, again, it's another reading comprehension section, but it specifically focuses on science. The other thing you'll have are data tables. Again, you have data tables on the SAT. You're not going to be doing any math with these. You're just going to be reading through them and interpreting what you're reading. And that's really it for these. Um, and then let me scroll down here. Yeah. So then again, there's also, essays at the end. And again, when it comes to the optional essays that are usually pretty friendly, um, again, most colleges are not looking for it. It is a very, 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 very short list of colleges that are looking for those ACT essays. Okay. I know I have been talking an awful lot today, and I appreciate you all listening. Do any of you have any questions at all about the SAT or ACT or anything like that? No? Okay. All right. So, Claire, did you want to talk about this one?
Yes, first, thank you, Megan. This is very informational. Um, I do have a question. So,
Sure.
how long do you suggest for a student to prepare for SAT, and when is the best grade or time for them to take the SAT or ACT?
Yeah. So, that is a great question. The answer to that is always it depends. I have had some students that they start preparing in 6th grade. I will be honest with you, I think it's a little early for preparing for the SAT. Unless you are in a pretty advanced math class or a pretty advanced, reading and writing class. I usually recommend at the earliest, maybe 8th grade, for starting to prepare for the SAT, just because of the reading comprehension and, of course, the math components. And typically for 8th grade, at least again here in the US, a lot of students have either gone through Algebra 1 and geometry, or they've at least started to touch Algebra 1. I've had a few that have gone through Algebra 2 in 8th grade, and usually those I wouldn't mind working with the math component of the SAT. But
Mm.
typically, starting about 8th grade is a great starting point. As far as when do you take it, I don't recommend taking it before high school just because even though there's not an expiration date on the SAT scores or ACT scores, colleges like to see them within a 4-year window of time. So usually I recommend students take their SAT their junior year of high school just because it's 2 years before they graduate and it's going to give a very accurate picture of where you are as you get prepared to head into that next phase of senior year and college life. So yeah, I would definitely say 8th grade is great to start.
Mm.
And definitely, trying to get a PSAT in your sophomore year, and then taking the actual SAT junior year, but you can certainly take it earlier.
Is a PSAT administrative from school, or you just do it yourself?
So typically schools administer it. A lot of them have started to administer it during the school day. Some will do it on a Saturday. It's only done once a year, usually in the fall around October, sometimes early November. And the scores from that usually come out around December.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Megan. And
You're welcome.
as Megan said, there are a lot of resources and materials online that you can prepare yourself. But if you need some extra help or professional help, for your the test strategy and any help to boost your score, uh, you can contact us. So we do have a code for 10% off if you get a package from us. The package is 5 classes per session. And yeah, and if you can scroll down to the next one, Megan, please. So yeah, you can log on to our website, the clubbolo.org, and find those packages. So if you have any anything, any questions for today's session or other things, you can email us. And if questions are for Megan, I will forward her. She will follow up. And let us know if you have any questions.